The morning the eviction notice arrived, Marcella Morgan was elbow-deep in soil, planting the last row of her winter squash, and she had no idea that the folded paper being pushed under her front door would change the entire course of her life. It was the autumn of 1883, in the sun-scorched territory of New Mexico, where the land was the color of rust, and the sky stretched so wide and blue above it that a person could feel both enormous and invisible at the same time. Marcella had come to this particular stretch of earth 3 years prior, following the death of her husband, Thomas Morgan, who had staked the claim and built the modest 2-room homestead with his own hands. Thomas had been a decent man, a quiet man, the kind who believed that honest labor was its own reward. He had died of fever in the July of 1881, leaving Marcella with 160 acres of New Mexico scrubland, a mule named Ezra, 12 hens, and a grief so deep and unannounced that it took her almost a full year to climb out of it. But she had climbed out. That was the thing about Marcella Morgan that most people in the nearby town of Cimarron did not appreciate, because she was not the kind of woman who made a lot of noise about her own resilience. She was 28 years old, with dark chestnut hair she wore in a thick braid down her back, and brown eyes the shade of good river mud, the kind that meant the soil was fertile. She was lean from honest work and weathered in the way that women who lived outside were weathered, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting against the prairie sun. She was not a woman who expected the world to be gentle with her, and the world had obliged her in that expectation with remarkable consistency. When she came inside that afternoon and found the notice, she did not immediately understand what she was reading. She sat down at the kitchen table with the paper in both hands and read it twice, then a third time. The language was formal and precise, the kind of language someone used when they wanted a thing to sound inevitable. The notice stated that by order of one Gerald Cutter, represented by the Cutter Land and Cattle Company of Santa Fe, the property at the Morgan homestead, being 160 acres in the county of Colfax, was now under legal dispute. It further stated that a deed transfer had been recorded in the county register in Santa Fe, superseding the original homestead claim filed by Thomas Morgan in 1879. Marcella Morgan was given 7 days, effective immediately, to vacate the premises and remove all personal property, or face legal removal by the county sheriff. She set the paper down very carefully on the table, the way you set down something fragile, even though it was just paper, even though the fragile thing was really her. Then she stood up, put on her coat, hitched Ezra to the small wagon, and drove the 14 miles into Cimarron. The town of Cimarron in 1883 was not a quiet place and had never pretended to be. It sat at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and had a history that read like a fever dream, cattle barons and railroad men and land speculators all circling the same territory like buzzards. The Maxwell land grant controversy had torn through the region for years, with families who had lived on the land for decades being pushed off by legal maneuvers that most ordinary people did not have the education or the money to fight. Marcella knew this history. She had watched neighbors pack their wagons and leave. She had thought, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had already lost too much, that it would not happen to her. She went first to the land office, a small weatherboard building on the main street that smelled of dust and paper. The clerk there, a young man named Fletcher with ink-stained fingers and an apologetic expression, confirmed what the notice had said. A deed transfer had indeed been recorded. Gerald Cutter's lawyers had filed the claim 3 months ago. The original homestead paperwork filed by Thomas Morgan had been challenged on the grounds of a technical deficiency in the original survey, and the challenge had been upheld by the county registrar. "Is it legal?" Marcella asked. Fletcher looked deeply uncomfortable. "It's been recorded, ma'am." "That isn't what I asked." "The paperwork is in order," he said, and then he looked at his desk in the way people looked at their desks when they did not want to be looked at directly. Marcella walked out. She stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of the land office and let the autumn wind hit her face and thought about what came next. She had a little money saved, not much. She had no family within 500 miles. She had the land, and the house Thomas had built, and the garden she had expanded every single year, and the knowledge of every rise and hollow in those 160 acres, and the fierce, quiet certainty that this land was hers. She was still standing there when the shadow fell across the sidewalk from the other direction. Harvey Dawson was 32 years old and had the kind of face that looked like it had been arguing with the weather for most of those years, all sharp angles and deep-set gray eyes under a battered hat the color of tobacco. He was tall, rangy in the way of men who spent most of their lives in the saddle, and he walked with the particular unhurried certainty of a man who had never much cared for being in a hurry, because the world would still be there when he got to it. He had been working cattle in the Colfax County region for going on 5 years, and he had a small operation of his own, about 40 head and a bunkhouse he had built himself on a leased parcel about 8 miles from the Morgan homestead. He had heard of Marcella Morgan, in the way that people in small territories heard of each other, which was second-hand and usually incomplete. He knew she was a widow, that she ran her place alone, and that she was one of the people Gerald Cutter had been making moves against. He knew about Cutter the way everybody in the county knew about Cutter. The man was rich, well-connected, and had been systematically buying, stealing, or legally maneuvering his way into ownership of every productive piece of land between the mountains and the river valley. Cutter was not from here. He was from the East, and he had arrived in New Mexico with Eastern money and Eastern lawyers, and a complete lack of interest in the human cost of his ambitions. Harvey had just come from the sheriff's office, where he had been asking about 2 of his own steers that had gone missing from the eastern edge of his leased land, and he was not in a good humor about what he had been told, which was essentially nothing. He noticed Marcella standing outside the land office not because she was a striking woman, though she was, but because of the way she was standing. She had both hands flat at her sides and her jaw set, and her eyes doing something complicated, the kind of look that meant a person was working very hard to keep their face from doing what their heart was doing. He recognized it because he had worn that look himself. He stopped. "Ma'am, you look like you've just received bad news." Marcella turned and looked at him. She assessed him in the quick, thorough way that a woman living alone in the territory learned to assess strangers, taking in the whole picture of him in a few seconds. He did not look like trouble. He looked like a working man, which was not the same as harmless, but was at least a starting point. "I have," she said. "Who are you?" "Harvey Dawson. I run cattle east of here, lease from the Patterson family." "Marcella Morgan." She watched something shift in his expression when she said the name. "The Morgan homestead," he said. It was not a question. "They're saying I have 7 days to leave it." Harvey took off his hat, which was a habit he had when he was thinking seriously about something, and held it in both hands. "Gerald Cutter. His company, yes. His lawyers filed paperwork on 6 other claims in this county in the past year," Harvey said. 2 families left. One man tried to fight it and ran out of money for legal representation before the case went anywhere. The other 3 are in varying states of limbo." He paused. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morgan." "That's a hard thing to be told." Marcella looked at him steadily. "I'm not leaving." He looked at her for a moment. "Good," he said, and the word was so simple and so direct that it surprised her. She had expected something more complicated, some version of an explanation of why that was impractical, some gentle suggestion of the wisdom of accepting what could not be changed. She did not get that. "I mean it," she said, as if he might retract it. "I believe you," Harvey said. "Do you have a lawyer?" "I have $7.40 saved, and that is the sum total of my legal resources." He put his hat back on. "Come have coffee," he said. "There is a man in this town I want you to talk to." The man he had in mind was Everett Haynes, who operated out of a back room of the dry goods store, and who was not strictly speaking a lawyer in the formal sense, but had more working knowledge of New Mexico land law than anyone else in Colfax County, who was willing to talk to ordinary people without charging them $50 for the privilege. Everett was 60 years old and had worked as a surveyor, a land agent, and a court clerk at various points in his long and varied life, and he had a particular burning dislike of what the large land companies were doing to the small homesteaders of the territory. The three of them sat around Everett's cluttered table with coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and Marcella showed Everett the notice. He read it carefully, then read it again, then set it down and looked at the ceiling with an expression that suggested deep internal calculation. "The technical deficiency in the original survey," he said. "Did Thomas Morgan file the survey paperwork himself?" "He did," Marcella said. "He did everything himself. He was very careful about it." "Do you have the original documents?" "I have everything he filed. I kept every piece of paper." Everett looked at her with new attention. "That may matter considerably," he said. "The claim Cutter's people are making is that the original survey did not conform to the requirements of the Homestead Act as amended in 1880. But if the survey documentation is intact, there may be grounds to challenge the challenge if you follow me." "I follow you," Marcella said. "The problem," Everett continued, "is that any challenge would need to be filed in Santa Fe, and it would need to be filed quickly, and it would need someone to carry it there and navigate the bureaucracy of the land office, which is not a simple thing to do." "I can go to Santa Fe," Marcella said immediately. "It's a 2-day ride," Harvey said. "Maybe more, depending on the roads." "I know how far it is," she said, not unkindly but with the clarity of a woman who had been underestimated before. "Mrs. Morgan," Everett said, "if you can bring me that original survey documentation by tomorrow morning, I will spend tonight drafting a formal objection to the deed transfer. It won't stop the clock, but it will create a legal record that Cutter's people will have to address before the sheriff can move on the eviction. It buys time." "How much time?" "That depends on how quickly they move and how well we can argue the case. Could be a week, could be more if we're fortunate." Marcella nodded once decisively. "I'll have the documents here by 7 tomorrow morning." She stood up, then paused. She looked at Harvey Dawson, who had said very little during the conversation but had been paying close attention in the way that still, quiet people paid close attention to things. "Thank you," she said to him. "You didn't have to bring me here." "No," he agreed, "but it seemed like the thing to do." She drove home through the darkening afternoon, and the land around her, the familiar red earth and the juniper and the long grasses gone gold with the season, looked both exactly the same as always and somehow more intensely itself, as if the threat of losing it had sharpened every detail into something almost painful to look at. She found the original documents in the cedar box where Thomas had kept all the important papers, organized with the careful thoroughness of a man who had expected his work to outlast him. The survey was there, every page signed and dated, with the original surveyor's certification still crisp and legible. She spread it on the table and read through it by lamplight, not because she doubted it, but because she wanted to understand what she was defending. She sat with Thomas's handwriting in her hands and felt his presence in the room with her, not as grief exactly, more as a kind of resolve that had traveled through the paper from his hands to hers. She was back in Cimarron at 5 minutes before 7 the next morning. Harvey Dawson was already there. She noticed him leaning against the wall outside the dry goods store, holding 2 cups of coffee, and felt something strange and unnameable move through her chest when she saw him. He was just a man she had met the day before. She had no reason to feel anything about his presence except perhaps mild surprise. "You're here early," she said. "I've been thinking about this all night," he said, and handed her one of the cups. "Cutter's men were in the saloon last night. I overheard them talking. He's planning to run cattle on the Morgan land. He wants the water access from your creek. That's what this is really about. The legal challenge is just the mechanism." Marcella wrapped both hands around the cup. "The morning was cold. Tell me something I don't know." He almost smiled. You're going to need more than Everett's objection. I know that too. There are other families Cutter has been moving against. If they all file simultaneous challenges, it creates a larger legal problem for his company. It's harder to dismiss one family than it is to dismiss several. She looked at him. How do you know all this? I've been watching Cutter operate for 2 years, Harvey said, and there was something in his voice that was not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it, something quiet and persistent. He moved on the Garza family's land last spring. Ramon Garza had a good claim, but he didn't know how to fight it, and his English wasn't strong enough to navigate the legal system, and he lost the place. His family had worked that land for 15 years. He paused. It was wrong. What happened to the Garzas was wrong. What's happening to you is wrong, and I am done watching it happen and doing nothing about it. Marcella studied him for a long moment. The morning light was coming up over the mountains, turning everything gold and copper, and Harvey Dawson stood in it with his jaw set and his gray eyes serious, and she thought that whatever was happening here, whatever this alliance was becoming, it felt solid in the way that few things in her recent life had felt solid. Why do you care about my land specifically? She asked. You have your own concerns. Because you're the one who got the notice this week, he said simply, and because someone needs to. Everett received the documents and spent that day and the next writing and rewriting the formal objection. Harvey wrote out to 2 of the other families Cutter had been pressuring, the Delacroix family north of town, and an older man named Abe Trenton who had a river bottom claim to the east, and he explained the situation and the potential for a joint challenge. Both agreed to add their names to the record. Meanwhile, Marcella went home and continued working her land with the fierce, concentrated energy of someone who refused to behave as if defeat were coming. She repaired a section of the fence line on the south pasture that had been sagging since the summer. She laid in more firewood. She pickled the last of the garden vegetables and stored them in the root cellar below the house. Every day she did the things a person did when they intended to keep living in a place, and every night she sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's lamp burning and read through everything she could find about New Mexico land law, which was not much, but it was something. Harvey came by on the 3rd day. He arrived in the late afternoon, riding a solid bay horse with a white star on its forehead, and he came around to where Marcella was working on the fence and dismounted, and without any particular discussion, simply picked up a post driver and began helping her. They worked side by side for 2 hours without much conversation. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that happens between people who are both engaged in the same physical task and have enough in common that the silence does not need to be filled. Occasionally, he handed her something or she pointed out where the next post needed to go, and the communication was so easy and natural that it felt like they had been doing this together for years. When they finished the section and stood back to look at it, Marcella said, "You didn't need to come out here. I wanted to see how you were getting on. I'm getting on fine. I can see that." He was looking at the fence and then at the garden and then at the house with its well-mended roof and the neat stack of firewood beside it. Something in his expression was careful and attentive in a way that had nothing to do with fence posts. "You've done a remarkable amount of work here on your own. Thomas started it," she said. "I finished it. We finished it together, I suppose, since he started it and I continued it. It's an ongoing project." "How long has he been gone?" 2 years this past July. He was quiet for a moment. "My father died when I was 20, he said. "Not the same thing, I know. But I know what it is to be working towards something that someone else started and to feel the weight of that." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what it is." He stayed for supper. She had not planned it and he had not asked for it. But the light was going, and she had a pot of beans and salt pork on the stove, and it seemed both impractical and inhospitable to send a man 14 miles home in the dark without feeding him. So she set an extra plate, and they ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and the conversation moved slowly and honestly through various territories. He told her about growing up in Texas, the youngest of 4 brothers, about learning to work cattle before he was tall enough to see over the saddle horn. He told her about coming to New Mexico 5 years ago, following a friend who had heard there was good grazing land to lease in Colfax County, how the friend had eventually gone back east to marry a girl from Georgia, and Harvey had stayed because the mountains were the first thing he had ever seen in his life that made him feel that the world was bigger than his own problems, and he had needed that. She told him about coming from Missouri, about meeting Thomas at a church social in Springfield when she was 22, about following him west when he talked about the land in New Mexico, the way some men talked about religion, with a kind of passionate certainty that was half faith and half desperation. She told him that she had been frightened the whole way west, frightened in a way she had not admitted to Thomas, but that the first time she had seen this particular stretch of land, her land, she had understood something about why people crossed the country to find a place to belong. "I belong here," she said. "I know that sounds like exactly the sort of thing someone says when they're in trouble and they're afraid of losing something, but I genuinely mean it. This is the first place in my life that has felt exactly the right size for me." Harvey looked at her across the table, across the lamp's warm circle of light, and said, "I believe you." The eviction deadline was on the 7th day, a Friday. By Wednesday, Everett had filed the objection with the county registrar and sent a copy to the land office in Santa Fe by fast post. He had also sent word to a journalist in Albuquerque who had been writing articles about the land grab situation in Colfax County, because, as Everett pointed out, legal documents could be delayed or lost, but newspaper articles had a way of making certain kinds of maneuvering less comfortable. On Thursday, Gerald Cutter himself arrived in Cimarron. Marcella heard about it from Mary Patterson, whose family owned the lease Harvey worked on, who came by the homestead in the morning to tell her that Cutter had ridden in the previous evening with 4 men and taken a suite of rooms at the hotel. He was a big man, 50 years old, with a red face and the particular bearing of someone who had been told yes for so long that the word no had become genuinely incomprehensible to him. "He's planning to come out here tomorrow," Mary said. She was a small, worried-looking woman of about 40 who had known Thomas Morgan and liked Marcella with a careful, practical affection. "With the sheriff." "I expected that," Marcella said. "Marcella." Mary's voice was gentle with something underneath it that was not gentleness. "Are you sure about this? You could go to Santa Fe, find a boarding house, start again somewhere." "I could," Marcella said, "but I won't." Mary looked at her for a long moment and then nodded once and rode away. Harvey appeared at the homestead that afternoon with something in his eyes that told Marcella he had already heard about Cutter's arrival. He dismounted and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said, "Friday morning, I'll be here. Harvey." She said his name in a particular way, carefully, like she was testing the weight of it. "You don't have to put yourself in the middle of this." "I am in the middle of this," he said. "I have been since that first day, when you were standing outside the land office looking like you were about to go to war." He paused and then said more quietly, "And I would very much like to continue being in the middle of it if you'll let me." The way he said it made something shift in the air between them. They were standing about 6 feet apart in the pale autumn sunlight, and the wind was moving through the juniper, and the whole territory was quiet around them in the way it got quiet sometimes, as if it were paying attention. Marcella said, "What exactly are you saying, Harvey Dawson?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm saying that I have thought about very little other than you and this land for the past 3 days, and I don't think that's going to stop, and I would like to be of use to you in whatever way you'll allow." He stopped. Then, with the particular courage of a man who was not accustomed to speaking about things he could not name, he added, "And maybe some ways that go beyond the practical." She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, and about the 2 years since, and about the particular loneliness of being competent enough to survive on your own and intelligent enough to know that surviving was not the same as living. She thought about the way Harvey had picked up the post driver without being asked and worked alongside her without commentary, and the way he had listened to her talk about belonging to this land without once suggesting she was being sentimental. "Ask me something real," she said. He did not hesitate. "May I come calling Marcella, properly, with intent?" "Intent toward what?" "Toward whatever you're willing to consider." She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Yes. But first, we have tomorrow morning to get through." The morning of the 7th day broke cold and clear, with frost on the ground and a sky so blue it looked painted. Marcella was up before dawn. She dressed carefully, not in her working clothes but in her better dress, the dark blue wool one, because she had decided that she was not going to be seen being evicted from her own land in patched canvas. She braided her hair and pinned it up and made coffee and stood on her porch with the cup in both hands and watched the sun come up over the mountains. Harvey arrived while the light was still new, and he was not alone. Behind him came Everett Haynes in his wagon, and behind Everett came the Delacroix family, father and mother and 2 grown sons, and Abe Trenton on his old gray horse, and Mary Patterson and her husband Robert, and 3 other families whose names Marcella half knew from church and from market days. There were 12 people in total, gathered in the yard of the Morgan homestead in the cold morning light, and Marcella stood on her porch and looked at them and felt something that was too large for the word gratitude. "I may have mentioned to a few people that there was something to be witnessed today," Harvey said, not quite smiling. "A few people," Marcella repeated. "The newspaper man from Albuquerque is also in town," Everett added from his wagon seat. "He arrived last night. I may have written to him more specifically than I mentioned previously." Marcella looked at all of them and then looked at Harvey and said, "You organized this." "We organized this," he said. "Everett did the legal work. I just talked to people." She wanted to say something that adequately represented what she felt, but the language for it did not exist in a form she was ready to use, so she simply nodded and said, "Then let's be ready." Gerald Cutter arrived at 10 o'clock with Sheriff Maddox and 2 deputies and his own 4 men, and when he rode into the yard and saw the assembled crowd and the thin, keen-eyed young man from the Albuquerque paper standing to one side with a notebook, Cutter's red face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on controlled fury. "Mrs. Morgan," he said from horseback. He did not dismount, which Marcella noticed. Men who expected to win stayed in the saddle. "The legal deadline for your departure has arrived. I urge you to collect your belongings and go peacefully." "I'm not going anywhere," Marcella said from her porch. Her voice was level and clear and carried across the yard without effort. "My husband filed a legal homestead claim in 1879 that meets every requirement of the Homestead Act. The original survey documentation is intact. A formal legal objection to the fraudulent deed transfer has been filed with the county registrar and the Santa Fe Land Office. And I suspect you know all of that, Mr. Cutter, because your lawyers are very thorough." Cutter looked at Sheriff Maddox. The sheriff, a man named Cal Maddox who had been in office for 3 years, and who Marcella had privately assessed as a man who did his best with a complicated situation, but was inclined to defer to whoever had the most leverage, shifted in his saddle with visible discomfort. "Mrs. Morgan," Maddox said, "the deed transfer is on record. It's being contested," Harvey said from the edge of the porch. He had positioned himself there with the easy, unhurried quality of a man who had absolutely no intention of moving. "As is the deed transfer on the Delacroix claim and the Trenton claim. All 3 objections were filed simultaneously and include documentation of the pattern of Cutter Land and Cattle Company's operations in this county. I understand the Albuquerque paper is very interested in that pattern." The reporter's pen was moving steadily in his notebook. Cutter's jaw was tight. "This is not over," he said. "No," Harvey agreed pleasantly. "It is not, but it is not over for us either." One of Cutter's men, a broad-shouldered man with a flat expression and a rifle across his saddle bow, urged his horse forward a few steps. Harvey looked at him with complete steadiness and said, I would advise you not to do whatever it is you're considering." There was a silence in the yard that had a particular quality, the kind that happens when everyone present is collectively deciding something without speaking. Marcella stood on her porch and held herself very still and thought about Thomas, and about the root cellar full of pickled vegetables, and about the fence she had mended, and about the winter squash just coming up in the garden. And she thought about Harvey Dawson, standing at the edge of her porch like he had grown there. Sheriff Maddox cleared his throat. "Given the contested status of the deed transfer," he said, with the air of a man choosing his words very carefully, "and given that formal objections have been duly filed, it would not be proper for me to enforce the eviction until the legal matter is resolved." He looked at Cutter. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cutter. The law has to follow its process." Cutter looked at the crowd and at the reporter and at Harvey Dawson and then finally at Marcella herself. She met his eyes and did not look away. "Over my dead body," Harvey said quietly, so that only the people nearest him could hear it clearly, "is this woman leaving this land." And then, with a tone that made absolutely clear he meant every syllable, he said it again, just slightly louder. "Over my dead body, and I mean that." Cutter wheeled his horse and left, and his men went with him, and the yard let out a collective exhale that sounded like wind through grass. The celebration was modest and genuine. Mary Patterson had brought food in her wagon, as people in small communities reliably do when they sense that a gathering is coming, and there were biscuits and cold chicken and a jar of apple preserves and 3 kinds of pie. They ate in Marcella's yard in the autumn sunshine and talked with the particular animated relief of people who have been bracing themselves for something, and found it did not fall on them after all. Everett ate 2 pieces of pie and told Marcella that the legal battle was not finished, that there would need to be formal proceedings in Santa Fe and possibly further challenges from Cutter's legal team, but that the filing of the objection and the public attention of the reporter had significantly complicated Cutter's ability to operate with the quiet speed that had characterized his previous maneuvers. "He counts on people not fighting," Everett said. "When they fight, his operation gets complicated." "Then we keep fighting," Marcella said. Harvey was standing a little apart from the main group when she found him, looking out over the pasture with a cup of coffee. She came and stood beside him, close enough that their arms were almost touching. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said, and for meaning it." He turned to look at her, and there was something very open in his face in that moment, something without the careful management that she was beginning to understand was his ordinary condition. "I meant every word of it," he said. "I know you did." She was quiet for a moment. "It is a very strange thing, Harvey Dawson, to have someone willing to stand in front of trouble on your behalf when they have no obligation to do so." "Maybe I feel an obligation," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because when I saw you standing outside that land office, looking like the whole world was trying to take something from you, and you were the only thing standing between it and succeeding, I thought, that is someone worth standing beside." He paused. "And then the more time I spent with you, the more I thought, that is someone I do not want to be without." Marcella looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the grass in the pasture, and the mountains stood blue and enormous in the distance, and the sounds of conversation from behind them were warm and human and close. "I have not let myself feel much of anything for a long while," she said honestly. "I made a decision when Thomas died that I was going to survive, and surviving required a certain amount of not feeling, but I find that around you, that is difficult to maintain." "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's terrifying, but it's not a problem." He almost smiled. It was a slow, careful thing, that almost smile of his, and she found she wanted very much to see it become a real one. "May I come calling Sunday?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You may." The legal proceedings in Santa Fe took considerably longer than a week. Cutter's lawyers were skilled and well-funded, and they did not give up easily. Over the following 3 months, there were formal hearings, document reviews, and a great deal of correspondence back and forth between Colfax County and the territorial capital. Everett Haynes proved formidable in ways that surprised even Marcella, who had already formed a high opinion of him. He had spent his long career accumulating exactly the kind of practical legal knowledge that proved useful in exactly this kind of fight, and he pursued the case with the energy of a man making up for years of watching injustice proceed unchallenged. The reporter from Albuquerque, whose name was James Whitfield, wrote 3 articles about the Cutter Land and Cattle Company's operations in Colfax County. The articles were specific and factual and infuriating, cataloging the pattern of legal challenges to homestead claims, the manipulation of survey technicalities, the intimidation of families who did not have the means to fight back. They named the families who had already been displaced, including the Garza family, and they made the case in plain and readable language that what was happening in Colfax County was not an isolated legal dispute, but a systematic campaign against ordinary people who had settled the land in good faith. The articles caused a considerable stir in Santa Fe, and the Territorial Land Office began its own review of the deed transfers Cutter's company had recorded in the county. Marcella read every word of every article at her kitchen table, and she thought about Ramon Garza and his family, 15 years on that land and then nothing. And she thought about how the injustice of it was only possible because most people did not see it or did not look, and how the act of looking directly at a thing and naming it honestly was its own form of resistance. She was not alone during those months. Harvey came calling on Sundays as he had asked, and he came by more often than Sundays on the various practical pretexts that presented themselves when a man was determined to spend time near a woman he was falling in love with. There were fence lines to evaluate, and a section of roof on the henhouse that he noticed needed attention, and several other small but genuine improvements he contributed to the homestead, with the matter-of-fact competence of a man for whom working with his hands was the most natural form of expression. She found herself looking forward to his arrivals with an intensity that she examined honestly and did not try to argue herself out of. She was not a woman who pretended to herself about her own feelings. She had loved Thomas Morgan in a good, steady, workmanlike way that had suited both of them, and she had mourned his loss fully and without holding any part of it at arm's length. What she felt beginning to grow toward Harvey Dawson was different in quality, not lesser or greater but different, something she had not expected to find in her life again, and had made a kind of unconscious peace with not finding, and its unexpected arrival was both wonderful and somewhat disorienting. Harvey was not a man who spoke easily about himself, but he spoke honestly when he did. He had been in love once before, he told her, on a cold November afternoon when they were riding the perimeter of her eastern pasture together. A girl in Texas when he was 25. It had not worked out, not because of any dramatic falling out but simply because she had wanted a settled life in a town and he had wanted the territory, and they had loved each other well enough to understand that love alone was not always sufficient to bridge that kind of difference. "Do you regret it?" Marcella asked. "Sometimes I used to," he said. "Less now." She understood what he meant without his having to explain further. December brought the first real snow, and word from Everett that the Territorial Land Office had suspended the deed transfer, pending a full review of the Cutter Company's documentation. It was not a final victory, Everett was careful to say. But it was the weight of the legal process shifting, and Cutter's lawyers had already missed 2 deadlines for filing supporting documentation, which suggested that their original claim was not as solid as it had been presented. Marcella got the news on a Tuesday and spent about 3 minutes allowing herself to feel the relief of it before she went back out to break the ice on the water trough for the cattle she had acquired over the summer. 4 heads she had bought from a neighbor at a price that strained her savings, but felt like an investment in the permanence of her occupation of the land. Harvey was there that Saturday and she told him about the suspension over coffee, and he sat quietly with the news for a moment and then said, "We're going to win this." Not yet, she said. No, but we will. You're very certain. I am certain of a few things, he said, and looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and this is one of them. She looked back at him across the table and felt the particular courage that sometimes comes from being seen clearly by another person, the way it can feel like a kind of permission to be exactly who you are without apology. Harvey, she said. Yes. I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it plainly without making it into something more complicated than it needs to be. All right, he said. I am falling in love with you, she said. And I think you know that. And I think you are falling in love with me too, and I think you have been for a while. And I have been watching you try to approach it carefully, and I appreciate the care, but I am 30 years old, and I do not have the patience I had at 20 for circling around the honest thing. Harvey looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she could not quite name, something that looked like relief and warmth and a kind of deep recognition all at once. You are the most direct person I have ever met, he said. Yes, she agreed. I love that about you. I know you do. And yes, he said very quietly, I am in love with you. I have been for weeks. I was not sure how to say it in a way that did not seem like it was taking advantage of a situation where you needed help. That's a very considerate worry, she said, and also unnecessary, because I am perfectly capable of determining whether someone is taking advantage of me, and you are not. He reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers. His hands were large and calloused and warm, and hers were calloused too from the same kind of work, and the joining of them felt like two things that were already the right shape for each other. Marcella, he said. Harvey, she said. I intend to do this properly, he said. I intend to ask you properly and in the right moment, but I want you to know now that my intentions are permanent. Good, she said, because so are mine. The winter passed with the particular intimacy of two people who are learning each other properly, which is a different and deeper thing than the early excitement of falling in love. They had Sunday dinners and long conversations by the fire. He rode out with her in cold, clear mornings to check on the cattle. She came to his leased place twice, a modest but tidy operation that told her a great deal about the kind of man he was, everything maintained and nothing wasted, and a clear sense of purpose in the way things were arranged. She met his neighbors, the Patterson family and two other families who leased from the same land grant, and they were kind to her with the warmth of people who had known Harvey Dawson long enough to be glad to see him happy. He met no family of hers because she had none within reach, but she told him about her sister in Missouri, Eleanor, who was older by 4 years and who wrote letters that arrived in irregular clusters when the postal service cooperated, and about her mother who had died young, and her father who was still alive in Springfield, and who she wrote to every month without fail. He listened to all of it with the attentiveness that she was coming to know as fundamental to who he was, the way he never seemed to be waiting for his turn to speak, but was genuinely present in the act of listening. January brought more correspondence from Everett and more legal back and forth, and February brought a formal hearing date in Santa Fe for March. Everett planned to make the trip himself and represent the interests of Marcella and the other affected families. He had by this point recruited the actual services of a lawyer from Albuquerque, a younger man named Aaron Cole who had read Whitfield's newspaper articles and had reached out voluntarily, stating that he found the case both legally interesting and morally compelling, and was willing to take it on reduced fees given the circumstances. Marcella liked Aaron Cole when she met him in Cimarron in late February. He was serious and precise and spoke in complete sentences, and had the organized energy of someone who found satisfaction in doing difficult things correctly. Cutter's original claim has at least 3 structural weaknesses, Cole told her, and Everett in the dry goods store back room, and the Territorial Review has identified 2 of them independently, which helps us significantly. The survey argument was always the weakest part of his case. The original Morgan survey was competently done and fully compliant. The challenge was based on a technical reading of the amended regulations that, frankly, requires a great deal of interpretive generosity to sustain. "Then we have a strong case," Marcella said. "We have a strong case," he confirmed. "I will not promise you a certain outcome because the law is not in the business of certainties, but I believe we will prevail." She walked out of that meeting into the cold February afternoon and found Harvey leaning against the hitching post with his horse, waiting, because he had driven in with her that morning and been conducting his own business at the feed store. He looked at her face and said, "Good news." "Good news," she said. He smiled, and it was a real smile this time, not the almost smile she had spent weeks learning to decode. It changed his whole face. She thought it was one of the best things she had ever seen. "Come on," he said. "I want to show you something before we drive back." He led her around the side of the main street to a lot on the eastern edge of town, an empty parcel with a foundation of stacked stone that someone had started and apparently abandoned. The lot had a view eastward toward the mountains that was so clear and wide it made the chest feel opened up. "Robert Patterson told me this lot has been sitting empty for 2 years, Harvey said. "The man who started the foundation gave up and went back to Kansas. Patterson thinks the owner would sell it for a reasonable price." He paused and looked at the foundation and then at her. "I have been thinking about building something more permanent than a leased bunkhouse." Marcella looked at the lot and then at him. "This is a very large thought," she said. "I have been having it for a while." "What exactly are you proposing, Harvey Dawson? Because if you're proposing what I think you're proposing, I would like to hear you say it plainly, in the spirit of things." He turned to face her fully and took both of her hands in both of his and said, without any circling or qualification, "Marcella Morgan, I am asking you to marry me. I am asking you to let me be your partner in all the ways that that word means, in the legal work and the fence mending, and the cattle and the years ahead and everything in them. I love you. I am certain of it, and I am certain of you, and I would very much like the rest of my life to be spent in your particular company." The wind moved between them and the mountains stood in the distance, and Marcella looked at Harvey Dawson and thought about all the things she had survived, and all the things she had built from survival, and all the ways the world had tried to make her smaller than she was and failed. And she thought about this man who had not once tried to make her smaller, who had in fact treated her bigness, her capability and directness and refusal to yield, as things to be valued rather than managed. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Harvey. I will marry you." He pulled her toward him and held her with both arms, and she let herself be held in the way she had not let herself be held for 2 years, which was completely, without any part of herself held in reserve. They were married on the 15th of April, 1884, in the small whitewashed church in Cimarron, with Everett Haynes standing up for Harvey and Mary Patterson standing up for Marcella, and most of the county in attendance, because word had gotten around both about the wedding and about the ongoing legal battle, and people in small territories attend the ceremonies that matter whether they are invited or not. Marcella wore the same blue wool dress she had worn on the morning of the eviction attempt, because it was her best dress, and also because she had come to think of it as a lucky one. Harvey wore a clean dark suit that he had purchased in Taos 2 weeks prior, and that fit him extremely well, and Marcella thought when she saw him in it that he was possibly the most pleasing-looking man she had ever been in a room with, which was a thought she kept private on the grounds that he already had enough dignity and did not need it added to. The vows were standard, but they said them as if they meant them, which they did, and when the minister pronounced them, married Harvey kissed her with a warmth and decisiveness that made Mary Patterson whisper something to her husband that caused him to smile. Aaron Cole was in the church as well, having ridden up from Albuquerque specifically for the wedding, and after the ceremony, he pulled Marcella aside and told her that the Santa Fe hearing had been rescheduled for May and that he was cautiously confident in their preparation. The delay was not ideal, but it was not devastating, and the suspension of the deed transfer remained in effect, meaning Marcella's occupation of the homestead was legally protected for the time being. Cutter had not been seen in Colfax County since October. His company had made no further moves against the remaining homesteaders. Cole's reading of this was that the public attention generated by Whitfield's articles and the formal legal challenge had made Cutter calculate that the return was no longer worth the difficulty. But he cautioned that Cutter had not formally withdrawn his claim, and until the hearing resolved the matter, the situation remained technically open. Marcella understood. She continued to prepare, continued to work the land, continued to cooperate with Cole and Everett on the documentation. She was Marcella Dawson now legally, though she continued to think of herself as Marcella Morgan Dawson, because she had been Morgan for too long and it was part of her and she saw no reason to leave it entirely behind. And Harvey, when she told him this, said simply, "Of course, that's who you are." They lived at the homestead, because it was a more established operation than Harvey's leased bunkhouse, and also because Marcella would not have left it even for a house in town. Harvey moved his cattle and his equipment and his few personal possessions, and the homestead expanded to accommodate 2 people, their operations combined so that what had been one woman's survival project became a genuine small ranch. Harvey had knowledge of cattle that complemented Marcella's knowledge of the land and the water and the gardens, and the combination was something larger than either of them separately. He was attentive and present in the way she had known he would be. He did not try to manage things she was already managing, and he did not assume authority in spaces she had already competently occupied. He asked her opinion on decisions and gave his own clearly, and accepted it when they disagreed and changed course when she was right, which was often enough that he took to telling her so directly. She had not expected this. She had hoped for it, because she was honest with herself, and she would not have chosen a man who would diminish her. But she had not known for certain until she saw it in practice day after day, the steadiness of his respect. He was also funny, which she had suspected from the beginning, and which became more apparent as the wariness of new acquaintance wore away. He had a dry, precise sense of humor that expressed itself in understatement, and was frequently delivered with a straight face, and it made her laugh in a way she had forgotten she could laugh, freely and without self-consciousness. She was happy. It was a specific and particular happiness, not the uncomplicated happiness of youth, but the kind that comes from having survived enough to know what you are grateful for. She had the land and the work and the mountains and the man she had chosen, and the legal battle still pending but no longer looming with the same immediacy, and the winter squash coming up again in the garden, and the cattle settled in the pastures, and Harvey Dawson at the supper table every night. The hearing in Santa Fe took place on the 14th of May, 1884. Marcella and Harvey made the trip together, staying the night at a boarding house in a town along the route, and arriving in Santa Fe on the morning of the hearing. Aaron Cole met them at the Territorial Land Office with his case files organized, and his suit pressed, and his expression conveying the particular focused calm of a man who has prepared thoroughly and knows it. The hearing was conducted by a panel of 3 land office officials, with Cutter's lawyers on one side and Cole and Everett on the other. It lasted most of the day. Marcella sat and listened to the legal arguments with the careful attention she brought to everything, and she understood most of it, and what she did not understand Everett explained to her in quiet murmurs during the recesses. Cole's argument was clear and methodical. He demonstrated that the original Morgan survey was in full compliance with the Homestead Act requirements at the time of filing, and with the requirements as amended, and that Cutter's lawyers had relied on a strained and selective interpretation of the amendment language that was not supported by the legislative record or by the practice of other land offices in the territory. He further demonstrated through documentary evidence that the deed transfer had been recorded without proper notification to the affected parties, which was itself a procedural violation. Cutter's lawyers were polished and expensive, and they made their arguments skillfully, but they were fighting uphill and the evidence was against them. By late afternoon, when the panel retired to deliberate, Cole told Marcella and Harvey that he believed the outcome would be favorable. They ate supper at a small restaurant near the boarding house, and Harvey held her hand across the table and neither of them said very much, because there was not much to say that was not contained in the fact of being there together, waiting. The decision came the next morning. The panel ruled that the original Morgan homestead claim was legally valid, that the Cutter Company's deed transfer had been improperly recorded and was therefore void, and that the claim should be restored to the legal status it had held prior to the fraudulent transfer. The decision also contained a formal notation of procedural irregularities in the Cutter Company's filings, which was not a criminal finding, but was a clear record of what had occurred. Marcella read the decision letter standing in the land office corridor with Harvey beside her and Everett and Aaron Cole on either side, and when she reached the final paragraph, she looked up and found that her eyes were full, which surprised her because she had thought she was past the easy crying of relief. Harvey put his arm around her shoulders and she let him, and she said, "We won." "You won," Everett said, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has done his best work. "The law did what it was supposed to do, which it does not always do, but today it did. The Garza family," Marcella said. She had been thinking of them. "Is there anything to be done for them?" Cole looked at her seriously. "Their situation is different," he said. "The time limits for challenging their displacement have passed. It would require a different kind of legal action, and I will not pretend it would be easy." He paused. "But I think it's worth exploring, if you're willing to help build that case." "Yes," Marcella said immediately. Harvey did not look surprised. They rode home through the New Mexico spring, through the land that was waking up in the particular way of high desert spring, the first green coming tentative and vivid from the red earth, the sky enormous and pale blue and full of light. Harvey rode beside her and they talked about everything and nothing, and sometimes they rode in silence that was full rather than empty. When they came over the last rise before the homestead and it appeared below them, the small house and the garden and the pastures and the creek glinting in the late afternoon light, Marcella pulled her horse to a stop and looked at it for a long moment. "It's still here," she said. "It's still here," Harvey agreed. "And it will be." Cutter's operation in Colfax County quietly retreated in the months that followed. The combination of the legal defeat, the newspaper coverage, and the territorial land office's formal notation of procedural irregularities had made his New Mexico ventures considerably less attractive as a business proposition. He did not vanish entirely from the territory, but he made no further moves against the small homesteaders of the county, and his company's presence faded in the way of things that find they cannot take root in hostile soil. The summer of 1884 was good. The cattle did well on the summer grasses, and the garden was the most productive Marcella had ever grown, and in September she told Harvey in the kitchen after supper with the lamp burning between them that she was expecting a child. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and said, "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "I am entirely well." "Good," he said, and his voice was different in a way that she found she could not look away from. "Good." He held her hand in both of his and looked at her with everything in his face open and present and unguarded, the way he looked sometimes when he was feeling something too large for his usual careful management of himself. "Marcella." "Yes. I love you so much it is occasionally inconvenient," he said. She laughed out loud at that. "That is quite possibly the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. It's the honest truth. I know it is." She turned her hand in his so that she was holding him back. "I love you too, Harvey, just as inconveniently." The winter was long, but they moved through it together, which made it a different thing than the winters she had lived through alone. Harvey was attentive in a practical, unsentimental way that she appreciated far more than excessive fussing would have been. He took on more of the heavier outdoor work without making a ceremony of it, and she continued to manage everything she was capable of managing. and they renegotiated the division of labor with the easy, unspoken efficiency of two people who understood each other. She wrote to her father in Springfield and to her sister Eleanor, and received back letters that were warm and celebratory, and in Eleanor's case also contained practical advice about pregnancy and childbirth that was occasionally terrifying and mostly useful. Aaron Cole wrote in December to say that he had made contact with Ramon Garza, who was living with his family in a town south of Albuquerque, and that there might be grounds for a claim against the Cutter Company for fraudulent displacement, not to recover the original land, which had since changed hands legitimately, but for material damages and formal acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. Marcella wrote back immediately expressing her full support and her willingness to testify or contribute whatever was useful. "It is not the same as getting their land back," she said to Harvey when she told him about the letter. "No," he agreed, "but it is something. It is making what happened visible and putting it in the legal record, and that is not nothing." "It is not nothing," she said. The baby was born in late March of 1885 in the bedroom of the homestead with Mary Patterson and a midwife from town in attendance. It was a long labor and an honest one, and Harvey sat outside the bedroom door for most of it in a state of controlled but evident terror that Mary Patterson later described to her husband as touching in a way you would not expect from such a composed man. The baby was a boy, strong and vocal, and possessed from the first moment of an expression of alert curiosity that Harvey said looked exactly like his mother's and Marcella said looked like nobody's in particular, and both of them looked at for long stretches without either of them feeling the need to explain why. They named him Thomas Harvey Dawson. Thomas for the man who had staked the claim and built the house, and whose careful paperwork had helped save the land. Harvey for the man who had stood at the edge of the porch and meant every word he said. Marcella chose it, and Harvey received it with a quiet that she understood was not absence of feeling but its fullness. Everett Haynes stood as godfather and cried openly at the christening, which he explained was simply the result of good whiskey and sentiment in combination, and which nobody believed but everyone pretended to. The homestead grew. The operation that Marcella and Harvey ran together expanded over the following 2 years. More cattle and a better barn, and a new well dug on the east side of the property, where the water table was better than they had initially hoped. They hired a hand named Pedro Vasquez, who turned out to be reliable and good-natured, and who taught Harvey more about managing cattle in the particular conditions of the New Mexico territory than Harvey had known before, and who Marcella fed prodigiously, because she believed that a well-fed worker was a worker who wanted to stay. Thomas grew from a loud, curious infant into a loud, curious toddler, who followed his father around the ranch with the serious intentionality of a very small person, who has decided that what the adults are doing is extremely important. Harvey carried him on his shoulders when they went to check the cattle and pointed out things in the landscape, and told him the names of plants and birds and landforms, with the patient thoroughness of a man who had decided that one of his most important jobs was to make sure this child knew the land he had been born to. Marcella watched them from the fence one afternoon, father and son, Harvey talking and the boy listening with that intent expression, and she thought about Thomas Morgan and about the kind of love that traveled through time in different shapes, the love that had built this place, and the love that had saved it, and the love that was standing out there in the afternoon light, making sure the next generation knew what it stood on. She thought she should probably go start supper, but she stayed at the fence a little longer than was strictly practical. In the spring of 1886, Aaron Cole wrote with news. The case against the Cutter Company on behalf of the displaced families had been settled. Cutter had agreed not to return any land, which was not possible, but to pay material damages to the families that had been wrongfully displaced, and the settlement included a formal legal acknowledgement of the fraudulent nature of the original deed transfers. It was recorded in the county register and would stand permanently in the legal record of Colfax County. Ramon Garza received his settlement in June of that year. Cole wrote that he had established a small business in Albuquerque and that the settlement, while not equivalent to what he had lost, gave his family a foundation to build on. He had said, Cole wrote, that he was grateful to the people of Colfax County who had fought when he could not, and that justice delayed was still justice, and that he intended to teach his children to read and to know their legal rights, and to never assume that the wrong answer to an injustice was silence. Marcella read that letter to Harvey at the kitchen table, and then she folded it and put it in the cedar box with all the other important papers: Thomas Morgan's survey documents and the court decision, and the marriage certificate and the baby's birth record, all the documents of a life that had been fought for and kept. Good, Harvey said. It was his favorite word when something was exactly what it should be. Yes, she agreed. The second pregnancy came in the autumn of 1886. Marcella was 33 by then and felt entirely herself, felt in fact more herself than she had at any prior point in her life, which she took as evidence that some people simply improved with the accumulation of experience and responsibility. She told Harvey on a Sunday morning with the same directness she brought to everything over the breakfast table, and he received the news with the same immediate concern for her well-being, and then the same deep, open warmth. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like myself," she said. "Which is well." "Good," he said and smiled, and she thought again that it was one of the best things she had ever seen. This time it was a girl, born in May of 1887, on a morning so clear and warm that the windows were open, and birdsong came into the room from the juniper trees outside. She was smaller than Thomas had been and quieter, and she looked at the world from the first day with a considering expression that made Harvey say she was already deciding things about it. They named her Eleanor Josephine Dawson, for Marcella's sister and for Harvey's mother, Josephine, who had died when Harvey was 15, and whom he had told Marcella about in the particular way that people tell you about the people they have loved most and cannot account for losing. Marcella wrote to Eleanor in Missouri immediately, and Eleanor wrote back a letter so long and full of exclamation that it took 3 pages to contain, and said that she intended to come visit before the year was out. And she did, arriving in October on the stage from Santa Fe, a compact, energetic woman of 37 who looked enough like Marcella to make Harvey do a small double take when she stepped down from the coach. Eleanor stayed for 3 weeks and spent most of it alternating between playing with the children and interrogating Harvey with the cheerful, thorough scrutiny of a woman who had worried about her younger sister for years and wanted to be certain the man she had chosen was everything she hoped. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had apparently reached her conclusions because she stopped the interrogation and simply fell into the rhythm of the household with the ease of someone who has found that things are better than she feared. "He's good," she told Marcella on the 4th day, sitting in the kitchen while the children slept. "He's genuinely good." "I know," Marcella said. "You seem very happy." "I am very happy. I'm also very tired, and there is always something that needs fixing, and the east pasture has a section of fence that is going to need replacement before spring, and I am happy." Eleanor looked at her and laughed. "That is the most you thing I have ever heard." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for you, the fence needing fixing is part of the happiness. You have never wanted things to be simple, you've wanted them to be real and yours, and that is what you have." Marcella considered this. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what I have." Harvey came in from outside in time to catch the end of this, and he looked at Marcella across the kitchen, in the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she might not be paying attention, which was the particular way of a man who was regularly astonished by his good fortune, and had not entirely gotten used to it. Eleanor saw the look and said nothing, but she smiled into her coffee cup with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose worrying has been definitively resolved. The years settled into the good rhythms of a life built solidly on chosen ground. Thomas grew into a boy who loved the horses with the single-minded devotion of someone who has found his particular calling, and who had inherited his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a combination that made him simultaneously easy to love and difficult to win an argument against. Alina grew into a bright, watchful girl who asked more questions per hour than seemed physically possible, and who had decided by the age of 3 that she intended to learn everything there was to know about everything there was. Harvey taught both of them to ride as soon as they were old enough to sit a saddle, and Marcella taught both of them to tend the garden and to read a land survey and to understand, in terms appropriate to their ages, that the land they stood on had been fought for, and that the fighting had mattered. "Why did people want to take our land?" Thomas asked once, at the supper table, at an age when he was old enough to understand the outline of the story. Harvey and Marcella looked at each other, and Marcella said, "Because they thought that having money and lawyers gave them the right to take what other people had worked for, and sometimes that works, because not everyone can fight back." "But you fought back," Thomas said. "We did," Marcella said, "and we were not alone. Mr. Haynes helped, and Mr. Cole and the Delacroix family and Mr. Trenton and the Pattersons, and a reporter who decided that telling the truth was more important than staying safe. Many people." She paused. "That is the lesson, if there is one, that it is harder to take things from people who stand together than from people who stand alone." Thomas thought about this seriously, in the way he considered most things. "And Mr. Cutter, what happened to him?" "He went somewhere else and tried his methods there," Harvey said. "I do not know whether he succeeded or not. Does it make you angry?" Thomas asked with the direct honesty of childhood. "Yes," Harvey said simply. "What he did to the Garza family and others like them is wrong, and there was no full restitution for it. That is an honest and appropriate thing to be angry about." He paused. "And the anger is most useful when it makes you careful to treat people fairly yourself, and to speak up when you see others being treated unfairly. That is what it is for." Thomas nodded, satisfied with this, and went back to his supper. Marcella caught Harvey's eye, and he caught hers, and something passed between them that was the particular communication of two people who have been talking to each other long enough that some things do not require words. Everett Haynes retired from his informal legal practice in 1889 and spent his remaining years in Cimarron, writing a detailed account of the land disputes of Colfax County, which was less a legal document than a historical record, an attempt to make sure that what had happened to ordinary families in the territory was not forgotten. He gave Marcella a copy when it was finished, handwritten in his careful clerk's script in a leather-bound journal, and she added it to the cedar box with all the other important papers. He died in the winter of 1891, peacefully, in his own bed, at the age of 68, and the whole county came to the service in the way that people come to the service of someone who has been genuinely of use to them for a long time. Marcella and Harvey sat in the front pew with the children between them, and Marcella thought about the morning. She had brought Thomas Morgan's survey documents to Everett's back room table, and about all the things that had followed from that morning, and felt a grief that was clean and complete in the way of grief for a life fully and well lived. Aaron Cole continued practicing law in Albuquerque and sent a letter to the homestead every Christmas, usually including some account of an interesting case and always asking after the family. He remained in touch with Ramon Garza, whose business had grown, and he wrote once that Garza had told him he named his youngest son Aaron in his honor, which he found both moving and slightly alarming, as he had not previously considered himself the type of person children were named after. The homestead prospered. By 1890, the operation was substantial enough that Harvey and Marcella had 3 full-time workers and had expanded into supplying beef to 2 of the nearby towns. They had added 2 rooms to the house, because the original 2-room structure was not sufficient for 2 adults and 2 growing children, and the steady stream of visitors that a household of that particular social gravity seemed to attract. The addition was built by Harvey and Pedro Vasquez over the course of a summer, and Marcella made sure the new rooms were oriented to catch the morning light, because she had always believed that good light in the morning made everything else in the day more manageable. On the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, Harvey and Marcella sat on the porch in the spring warmth after the children were in bed, and the mountains were the color of shadows in the dusk, and the first stars were coming out over them, and the land spread away in every direction in the particular quiet that the territory had after the working day was done. "What are you thinking?" Harvey asked. It was a question he asked sometimes, not as a conversation prompt but as genuine inquiry, because he was still, after 6 years, interested in what was moving through her mind. "I'm thinking about the morning the eviction notice came," she said. "I was in the garden. I was planting winter squash. I had no idea. No idea about the notice or no idea about everything that followed it. Both," she said. "All of it. I had no idea about you." He looked at her in the dim light with the steady gray eyes that she knew as well by now as she knew the landmarks of her own land. "I had no idea about you either," he said. "I was minding my own business, and then there you were, outside the land office, looking like you were ready to take on the whole territory single-handed." "I was," she said. "I just didn't expect help. You got it anyway." "I got considerably more than I expected," she said, and let the weight of it settle into the honest truth of it, the more being him and the children and the life that had grown up around all three like something that had always been meant to root there. Harvey reached over and took her hand, the way he had been taking her hand across various tables and fences and pasture gates for 6 years, with the ease of a man who has found the precise right fit for something and intends to hold on to it. The mountains were dark now, and the stars were thick and bright, and the territory was vast and quiet and entirely itself. And the cedar box in the bedroom held Thomas Morgan's survey, and the court decision, and the marriage certificate and Everett's journal, and 6 years of other documents of a life. And somewhere in the root cellar below the house were shelves of preserved vegetables put up in the autumn, and in the barn Pedro would make his last check of the cattle before the night. And in the 2 new rooms the children slept. Marcella leaned her head against Harvey's shoulder and looked at the stars and thought that this, specifically this, was what it felt like to have won something that mattered. "Harvey," she said, "yes, I am very glad you were outside the land office that day." "So am I," he said against her hair. "So am I." They sat there on the porch while the night settled in around them and the stars moved in their slow arc, and the land held them as it had always held her, firm and particular and entirely hers, theirs now, the ground beneath everything else, the thing they had fought for and kept and built a life upon that was bigger and richer and more full of noise and love and morning light than anything she had imagined possible in the dark winter of her alone years. And it was enough. It was exactly, precisely, and abundantly enough.